A China Cold War strategy. The Committee on the Present Danger China is an independent, nonpartisan effort to educate and inform American citizens and policymakers about the existential threats presented from the People's Republic of China under the misrule of the Chinese Communist Party. Its purpose is to explain these threats that range from the PRC's accelerating military buildup, its active information and political warfare that targets the American people and our businesses, political and media elites, cyber warfare, and economic warfare. So stay with us. We're going to talk to the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China today. According to their website, presentdangerchina.org, the mission of the Committee on the Present Danger China is to help defend America through public education and advocacy against a full array of conventional and non-conventional dangers posed by the People's Republic of China. As with the Soviet Union in the past, Communist China represents an existential and ideological threat to the United States and to the idea of freedom, one that requires a new American consensus regarding the policies and priorities required to defeat this threat. And for this purpose, it is necessary to bring to bear the collective skills, expertise, and energies of a diverse group of experts on China, national security practitioners, human rights and religious freedom activists, and others who have joined forces under the umbrella of the Committee on Present Danger China. The original Committee on the Present Danger was originally formed in 1950 by citizens concerned about Soviet communism's influence on the West. It was designed as a citizens' lobby to alert the nation to the Soviet present danger and the resulting need to adopt a document called NSC 68, an agenda in order to survive. NSC 68 was a top secret National Security Council document written by a man named Paul Nitze, promoting a US-led national security strategy for the purpose of rolling back communist influence in the world. As a result of these efforts such as this, both in and out of government, the recommendations of NSC 68 were eventually adopted. President Harry S. Truman adopted a policy of containment and the strategy that ultimately led to the downfall of the Soviet Union's Communist Party. The Cold War and an era of confrontation policies short of all-out war became a political reality in the United States. One of the largest reasons the USSR was such a threat was its development and investment in a nuclear weapons arsenal and delivery capabilities to match the USA and the Western Alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in Europe and around the globe. But China has not openly engaged in a nuclear weapon buildup that is capable of even matching, let alone achieving supremacy over the USA and the West. So using that as a driving force for the new Committee on the Present Danger China effort is not likely to be a key part of its initiatives. However, the COVID-19 Wuhan China virus cover-up and disinformation campaign by the Chinese Communist Party against the United States and the West clearly reveals the Chinese communists are engaged in an all-out effort to influence our allies and enemies alike, that China is not only a near-peer competitor aimed at increasing the prosperity of its country, but engaged in a strategy to challenge the world's remaining democracies and the freedoms they represent. Any new Cold War strategy will be different than the NSC 68 policy, but how? My guest today is Frank Gaffney, Jr., Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, a not-for-profit, nonpartisan educational corporation established in 1988. Under President Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gaffney acted as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. He served as chairman of the high-level group NATO's Senior Politico-Military Committee and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy under Assistant Secretary Richard Pearl. He was also a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Mr. Gaffney is the Vice Chairman of the Committee on Present Danger China, and we're glad to have him on the Rob Maness Show. We welcome Mr. Frank Gaffney, the Vice Chairman of the Committee on Present Danger China and the Executive Director of the Center for Security Policy, and a staunch patriot and longtime servant of the United States, to talk about why a strategy focused on China from an older perspective, like the one we used against the Soviet Union, is important to develop and get in action right away. Mr. Gaffney, welcome back to the Rob Maness Show.
It's great to be with you, Rob. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here, especially amid all the stuff going on with the virus and those kind of things. But the virus is really what got my attention on an event I saw happen at the end of April. And that was a letter from national security, religious freedom, professionals and activists to basically to the United States government on why we shouldn't be having federal employees and military personnel's thrift saving plans, that's a retirement that's similar to a 401k, investing in Chinese military industry corporations. And I saw in reading the notes about that action at the end of April, I said, that's good. I wasn't aware they were doing it. I was a participant in the TSP when I was in the military myself. And that's right, we shouldn't be investing in those type of corporations, but that's a very small part of the bigger picture. And when I saw the Committee on the Present Danger China reestablish itself and come back out in the open, I remembered from the 1950s, the first Committee on the Present Danger, which was focused at Soviet communism and communism in general around the world. And ultimately, it was that effort that led to a document called NSC 68, which ultimately led to the Cold War policies that resulted in the Soviet Union's downfall eventually, through many long twists and turns and roads and those kind of things. But so what's the background on the committee as it's coming out now to help the United States and the West establish the appropriate type of policy towards China? Because we've obviously seen with this pandemic response, they've revealed themselves that they have quite an effective hegemonic goal and policy to thwart those governments that protect freedom, like the United States and Western democracies.
Yeah, such an important question, Rob. Let me just interject. Between the 1950s version of the Committee on the Present Danger and the present effort focused on China, there were actually two other iterations. One that I think was singularly impactful. You mentioned the NSC 68, but in the 1970s, starting about 1976, a new Committee on the Present Danger was convened. Again, each of them have had a similar character. They've brought together, national security practitioners and subject matter experts and business leaders and religious freedom and human rights activists to focus on what my old boss Ronald Reagan used to call existential threats to freedom. And the one that came together in 1976 actually had as one of its members Ronald Reagan, and they began working much as the 1950s one did, and much as we're doing now, to try to articulate both what the nature of the threat was at the time and to espouse a strategy for dealing with it that was different than the sort of official U.S. government line. Back then, it was what was called détente. Successive American presidents of both parties had said, we really want to have a close and friendly relationship with the Soviet Union. We'll use arms control. We'll use credit guarantees and loans and technology transfers and the like to try to make them more benign and see if we can't really join forces for the betterment of the world. President Reagan didn't believe, or excuse me, Ronald Reagan, then even at that point not yet a candidate for office, let alone actually in office, embraced this alternative idea that the Committee on the Present Danger came up with, which was basically to resist what the Soviet Union was doing, to try to counter it effectively, and ultimately to bring it down. And he not only embraced that idea, he called it peace through strength, or strategy of we win, they lose. He took it to the American people. He got a mandate to implement it as the strategy of the United States, and then he pulled in 31 members of the Committee on the Present Danger to try to help him execute it. They did. The rest is history. The Soviet Union is no more. Subsequently, there was another group that came together in the early 2000s after 9/11 to try to see what could be done to help with the terrorism problem. But the threat that we're facing today from China, I would argue, makes the terrorist threat paled in insignificance. Even the Soviet Union in its heyday, far less serious than this, and for the reasons that you've alluded to, Rob. There are hegemonic ambitions combined with an immense amount of effort that has been employed to build up through asymmetric warfare means, as well as increasingly the capability to use old-fashioned kinetic kinds of warfare to achieve the goal of Xi Jinping, the current General Secretary of the Communist Party, namely to become the world's dominant power, and if necessary to defeat the United States, if that's what's required to become that world-only superpower, dictating really to everybody else.
Yeah, that's one of my major concerns, and the reason why I'm pleased to see the committee roll back out and take this on, and I'll do whatever I can to help them myself, having been a national security
Wonderful.
professional for a long time myself. But the issue that we face with the Chinese Communist Party really is completely different than the Soviet Union, not from a military perspective necessarily, but from an economic ideology mixed with a government ideology of communism, but an economic ideology that uses the parts and pieces of capitalism to become prosperous. So we have a prosperous Chinese communist government as opposed to the Soviet Chinese or Soviet communist government, which in the end it was its economic failures that really played a huge role that President Reagan and Yal's team was able to bring about. So with these folks in China, I mean, they have taken a different approach to infiltrate, for want of a better term, into our capitalist financial systems, our education systems. Theft of intellectual property is a major issue, and they've developed a system of systems that's focused on asymmetric type warfare as opposed to the old kinetic iron on iron warfare that the Soviet Union was initially focused on, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. I guess I would say that a formative moment in all of this, I think the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party have been more or less unchanged since it came to power in 1949. But a very pivotal moment was when, as you say, the Soviet Union collapsed. And basically that was a result of the strategy that I was just talking about. Ronald Reagan's determined effort to take down the cash flow that enabled the Soviet Union to continue to operate. It had a tiny economy, and yet it was operating this massive empire and this enormous strategic nuclear buildup and so on. And it was doing so by primarily garnering some funding from the West. What Deng Xiaoping, who was the then General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, concluded when he saw the Soviet Union implode, basically because it was bankrupted by Ronald Reagan's strategy a couple of years after he left office. But they realized that the Soviet Union had lost the first Cold War and that a new one was beginning and that China would win that one. And the strategy Deng Xiaoping laid out to do that, he came to call hide and bide. Hide the fact that the Chinese communists have this agenda of world domination. Bide their time pending the moment when they could decisively act against the West. But at the core of it is exactly the point that you're making, Rob, that they realized the great error that the Soviet Union had made was they didn't as fully penetrate the West as they needed to. They were working at it, but in fact, I think part of why they didn't succeed was they were so brazen about the military threat that they were going to pose to the West, their ambitions to bury us, as Nikita Khrushchev famously put it. And so while the West Germans and the French and the Brits and the Italians and others were anxious to try to put money into this policy of détente, or Ostpolitik as it came to be called by the Germans, into the Soviet Union, it wasn't enough. When Ronald Reagan brought the cash flow down, it fell apart. The Chinese were determined not to let that happen to them. So they began in earnest, I think, in the early 1990s, to see what they could do to profess an openness to Western investment, to encourage this idea that if they were simply made a member in good standing of the international community, of course, at the United Nations, but more broadly in international organizations, if they were able to get access to our technology and our productivity and our markets, including notably our financial markets, that all would be wonderful. They would be members in good standing of the international community. That strategy, hiding their true intentions and biding their time, has paid off massively for the Chinese Communist Party. And that's why I would argue they constitute truly the most extreme existential threat to freedom this country has ever faced in its history.
Yeah, and I think the most revealing moment that led me to a realization that they had done that effectively and accomplished a huge part of that mission is when they got the WHO in January 14th. I will not forget the day the WHO retransmitted the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda that the Wuhan virus was not being transmitted from humans to humans. And that put the entire world behind. We've heard President Trump talk about it before in various ways. It put us all in a position of not taking the threat as seriously as we needed to. And that ability of the Chinese Communist Party to put their message into an organization that has been a part of the institutions of the West for many years now, whether you trust those types of organizations or not, the intent was to be able to take collective action in a pandemic and those types of situations through that organization, and it completely failed us because of the Chinese Communist Party's abilities and capabilities. So what is the committee looking at from a perspective of policy specifics on how to address this ability of the Chinese Communist Party to conduct this asymmetric Cold Warfare and really get into all of our institutions? I mean, they're in, and they're in a much bigger way than the Soviets ever were.
That's exactly right. Well, as in the past, the committee has been focused since it rebooted, if you will, in March of 2019, by focusing intensively on trying to just get our hands around the nature of this threat. It is a multifaceted problem we're facing from China. We've talked about asymmetric warfare. Another term that the Chinese have actually used to describe it is unrestricted warfare. And that was the name of a book, as you may know, Rob, that was written in 1999 by two senior colonels in the People's Liberation Army. I think it was actually called in Chinese title, The War Plan Against America, or something to that effect. But it came to be known here as unrestricted warfare, and it identified, I think, some 20 different steps that Communist China could take to attack the United States without using kinetic means, because in 1999, for sure, they did not have the military power to take us on. But what they began to do, and you really, if you look at that book, if you look at the game plan that it laid out, they have operated on just about every one of the various lines of attack. So our committee has been trying to sort of catalog those, and primarily through short, very, I think, informative videos that are all available at presentdangerchina.org, to communicate to the American people what it is we are up against, and the kind of things that are really, particularly taken together, mortal threats to a country like ours. Now, this was a harder job before the pandemic, quite frankly. There were people, Donald Trump was certainly one of them, and I think the people who elected him were as well. But an awful lot of other Americans, we're so accustomed to this idea that, as long as we're doing business with the Chinese, we're not going to have any problem with them. How could they possibly want to engage in anything really hostile to us, since we're their biggest, customers, and we've got this enormous trade deficit with them and so on. Well, the pandemic, I think, has caused a lot of people to revisit some of those assumptions. The old line about a conservative is a liberal who was mugged by reality. Well, there are a lot of Americans who've been mugged by the reality of what the Chinese communists have done to us with this, I call it the Chinese Communist Party virus, CCP virus, and the pandemic that's ensued from it. And you just put your finger on one just microcosmic example of it. They told the WHO not to tell the truth to the world about the nature of the problem that they were having. Why? In part because they were scarfing up all of the personal protective equipment and other stuff they'd need to counter it, so that the rest of the world wouldn't have their allocations. And also, not trivially, so they could send people who may well have been infected with the disease from China, from Wuhan, literally itself, to other parts of the world, to ensure that the entire world was going to be afflicted by this disease, not just China. So these are the sorts of insights that we now have to work with at the Committee on the Present Danger of China. And we're extremely appreciative for you and programs like yours helping to communicate to the public as much as we can, both this warning about what we're up against and some good ideas that we've come up with for what to do about it.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on two of the things, the WHO piece, but also that got me thinking about, well, we need a Western US-led strategy that's more aligned along the old Cold War days, not necessarily focused on nuclear arsenal buildup and that kind of capability, not necessarily. Now, we'll get to that in a second, because there's a significant risk with those guys, but focused on things like supply chain. One of the first articles I wrote after the pandemic became apparent was about the supply chain on the medical side, especially to do with antibiotics being 90% controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. That type of a policy or set of policies focused on just the supply chain was part of the Cold War policies that developed over, from the 1950s and on to when we defeated them, was protecting strategic supply chains and making sure that the United States and the West always had access to things that were strategically important because we controlled them. So that's what got me
Right.
thinking about this. And then when I saw your committee come back out as a repurpose towards China, well, that's the right move. We've got to get the whole of government and the experts from a broad range of capabilities to come together and develop specific policies that will address this, right?
Yeah. Well, look, your corporate memory is so valuable because, I mean, basically what you just described isn't so much some sort of exotic national security policy strategy. It's really just common sense. You don't want to rely on hostile powers for things you vitally need. And I think Americans of all walks of life have had a similar kind of epiphany to what you talked about in your article, and I'm sure in part because of your article. Another of our colleagues, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, is Rosemary Gibson, and she's the co-author of a book called China RX. And she was, I think, the first to really sound this alarm back in 2018, that we were dependent, critically dependent on China for not just things like masks and gowns and gloves, but for medicine. And it's not just antibiotics, by the way. It's vitamin C, for heaven's sakes. It's aspirin. It's all kinds of things, penicillin. And these are sort of microcosms of the much larger problem that we now confront. Supply chains is kind of how it's been described. We are dependent upon China for clothing, for shoes, for flat screen displays, for silicon chips, for phones, for the rare earth minerals that go into a lot of that stuff. I mean, on and on. These are the sorts of things that it's insane, frankly, to be reliant upon, certainly on a nation like China that has nothing but, I believe, ill intent towards us. And the reason that we are so dependent, and a lot of people say, how could that possibly have happened? Wasn't anybody paying attention? Well, we were paying attention, kind of. The government thought that it was going to be fine for us to have this open trading relationship. It turned out it was a predatory trading relationship. And the folks on various corporate boards loved the idea that they were going to be able to maximize their profit by reducing their costs, even if that meant doing business with, well, basically, slave labor populations in China. And the Wall Street guys were really probably the worst of the bunch because I'm not sure that the Chinese actually were that good a bet fiscally, financially. I think they made a lot of money in their various commissions and so on. But when they were migrating perhaps as much as $3 trillion, Rob, to the Chinese Communist Party in the form of investments in various companies of different kinds, none of whom, by the way, conform to our laws regarding or regulations regarding accounting or other security practices in this country. I'm not sure that they were making a lot of money for their beneficiaries, but they were certainly helping the Chinese. And the net effect of all of this, the supply chains and the exchange, deficit and the migration of capital from our stock and bond markets, has enabled precisely what we're talking about, which is now a formidable adversary equipped with all of these various asymmetric capabilities in space, undersea, in the Arctic, in this hegemonic Belt and Road colonial infrastructure build out, in the South China Sea, 5G. I mean, you could go on and on. Not least military capabilities as well, including nuclear ones. That's all been made possible, basically, by our underwriting. And that has to stop. If there's anything that we at the committee have really focused in on and argue to the American people and others around the world, as you say, we need a free world mobilization effort here. It's got to be rooted in doing what Ronald Reagan did to the Soviets, cutting off that cash flow urgently.
We absolutely are going to need to do it, and it's going to be harder to do because of, as we've discussed, their approach to financing and economics took a different turn than the Soviets did. They learned from
Yep.
that failure, and you also touched
Penetration.
on, and we haven't talked about this other piece of asymmetric capability that they focus on, and that is cyber operations and cyber warfare, whether cold or hot, either one. I mean, these folks. Before I left the Air Force in 2011, and I had to see major operations to deal with Chinese cyber warfare operations that aren't widely known. But folks, if you're interested, look up Operation Buckshot Yankee, and you'll see how something as simple as a device you plug in your computer can be used to detect even things like combat sorties, fighting the war. So, and you mentioned Huawei and 5G, those overlaps, those all capabilities, including supply chains, all overlap into the kinetic military world, ultimately culminating in the vastly capable nuclear weapons arsenals and delivery capabilities with using those technologies, but also being able to use those technologies to subvert and make our forces much more ineffective, don't they? And that's where I wanted to take this to as we wind up here. And let's talk about the threat from the nuclear weapons capability and arsenal and conventional and cyber and the gambit of their military forces. Because, you've seen in Chinese communist newspapers op-eds that have said, well, we'll just withhold medical supplies and disrupt the supply
Mm-hmm.
chain to the world if they mess with us, and those kind of things. So that's not an idle threat in my mind after seeing what they've done, and not just now, but in the past too. When it comes to military perspective, they don't have a huge strategic arsenal, but they are slowly building. And we mentioned before we came on the air the new strategic bomber that is a look-alike of the B-2 bomber, which is
Yep. Carbon
today's
copy.
most advanced bomber in operation.
Right.
And they will continue to do that and slowly build that capability up until they can challenge not just us, but the rest of the world. And we need to take positions and establish policies to address those things across the gambit, whether it's military, political, informational, or whatever, don't we?
Well, look, I'm so glad that you're bringing this up, Rob, and I think it's a function of your past service to our country as a nuclear officer and in the Defense Department working on nuclear forces policy issues, that we understand how important this stuff is. Most of the rest of us have long since stopped thinking about it, and hence, we've got an obsolete nuclear deterrent force, I'm sorry to say at this point. We're not so sure how large the Chinese nuclear force is. Let me give you one reason for that uncertainty. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine by the name of Phil Carber, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, you may know him, he's an old Pentagon hand. He's also a professor at Georgetown University, and he assigned some of his students, undergraduate and graduate students, to look into something that had sort of fascinated him. And they wound up coming up with some information that the CIA had not understood. It is called the underground Great Wall. And according to Phil Carber's analysis, and I think it's now been validated by the intelligence community as well, the Chinese have built about 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels in China. That's about across the country once and almost half back again in the continental United States, just as a point of reference. 3,000 miles. And what we believe is concealed in that complex of tunnels is their ballistic missile programs. On mobile launchers moved around so that they couldn't be targeted, but also so they can't be counted. And it's anybody's guess, honestly. And I have to just tell you, we've been told for decades that the Chinese have sort of capped the number of nuclear weapons that they've got in their arsenal at somewhere between 200 and 400. I have no basis for saying that, but that's nonetheless been sort of the canonical line of the arms control community. The reality is, you wouldn't build 3,000 miles of tunnels to hide 400 nuclear warheads. That's for sure. So my guess is we're probably going to be surprised, and who knows under what circumstances that surprise may be revealed. But God forbid that it's in the course of a war. But I think we're going to learn to our horror that the Chinese have put into place a complete strategic nuclear triad, as we call it. Ground-based forces in these tunnels and submarine-based forces that operate out of hardened caves that have been hollowed out for the purpose of their submarine pens being hidden and unmonitored. And then, of course, this air-breathing deterrent, as it's called, including now a brand new version of the B-2 bomber. And you put all this together, and my fear is that the Chinese are approaching the point where they feel as though they can, with impunity, engage in military operations against us, not just these asymmetric threats.
Well, when you realize how many inroads they've made, no pun intended, by the Belt and Road Initiative and the debt that they carry for all the different countries of the world, that gives them access to strategic ports and runways and highways and communications infrastructure that the Soviet Union would have loved to have had, and it just confirms that I've always thought the U.S. Space Force initiative was the right way to go, because we needed a capability that was looking specifically for and at major threats when they were discovered them from on high, and we have some great technology that enables us to do that. And this is a challenge. This tunnel system has to be a challenge to become made known, just as we've done with every other system, so that we can appropriately hold it at risk, as we used to say in the nuclear business, so that they don't feel comfortable using them. And that is one of my major concerns. If in fact the size of the arsenal is much larger than what you and I think it is, and we think along the same lines. I have no basis to say what the number is, but I can confirm that your numbers are what I believe too. But I've also been watching them build submarines and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and now this bomber and intercontinental ballistic missile capability using our technology that we inadvertently or maybe even inadvertently transferred to them to build this capability which can match us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I again, as an old Cold Warrior, let me just say to you, I believe that if we were facing what we are seeing from China today in the Cold War, and we were approaching it with that same common sense, national security mindedness that we did through most of the Cold War, the Soviet threat, I believe we would probably be at a fairly high level of nuclear alert, simply because this danger is now so substantial. And it's coming at the same time, in the wake of this pandemic, notably. Rob, as you know, the Chinese are becoming much more bellicose in their rhetoric. They are much more assertive now in the South China Sea. They are threatening Taiwan. I honestly wouldn't be entirely surprised if they didn't go for it in Taiwan, in an actual invasion. And in part, if they do, it will be because they've persuaded themselves that they have now got sufficient military power to deter us from thinking about threatening them with nuclear attack if they do such a thing. And that they may even calculate that they now have a sufficient quantitative and even qualitative edge in the Western Pacific to ensure that we are not able to interfere with their military activities out there. Sun Tzu, their famous strategist of several thousand years ago, famously said, it's better to defeat an enemy without fighting. I think that would be their preference. They've put into place the means by which they feel that they can defeat us without fighting. And I hope that they are wrong about that, and I hope that we will take the sorts of steps necessary to restore the deterrence that we've taken for granted for too long and that is urgently needed, specifically with respect to the Chinese Communist Party.
I agree with you, and people could say what they want about the current president, but the administration and policy advances that he's brought on board, especially in the national security area and now the economics area, I hope that will stay and become part of a Cold War strategy, for want of a better term, towards the Chinese, is that they no longer can be assured that we won't use our ultimate capabilities if we need to protect us and our friends. And I think that may be part of their calculus, because it appears they're moving faster. You mentioned they're much more bellicose and aggressive. And we've seen that through this pandemic, too, yes, with active disinformation and propaganda campaigns, not just around the world, but within the United States systems, much more aggressive than the Russians were in 2016. I think maybe some parties in this country may be thinking they were wishing for the Russians' activities, which were pretty weak and benign compared
good old
to
days,
what these guys are doing.
Right.
Exactly right. So,
right.
So yeah.
But, as a student of history, you'll appreciate this. Just one last point, if I may. We're looking at, I'm afraid, the possibility that the Chinese are doing what totalitarians often do when they get into trouble, which is to try to, well, it's called social engineering by the social scientists. They create this boogeyman of an external threat to try to, sort of compel their populace to sort of lose sight of their objections to the government in question, which has treated them very badly, of course, in the run of this pandemic. But to rally around the flag, to cite some foreign threat, as I say, and to try to get people to go, well, if necessary, fight that foreign enemy. That's the kind of dynamic that I fear is operating at the moment, and is very, very fraught indeed.
It is, and there's only one thing that can put that issue back to rest where it should stay, and that is a strong, coherent, combined strategy from the West, just like we did in with NATO and other democracies towards the communists in the Soviet Union, and we've got to take that on.
You're so right.
I'm so glad the committee has repurposed itself and is looking at that. I look forward to working with you all and continuing this, so that we don't have to go to war in an all-out war. That was the whole point of peace through strength.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Frank. We appreciate having you on.
My pleasure, Rob. Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, my friends, we want to thank Frank Gaffney for joining us today and educating you and me on the Committee on the Present Danger China effort and why it's important for the West, led by the United States, to develop a strategy to confront the rising Chinese Communist Party in its effort to become the world's superpower. Until next week, this is the Rob Meany.